Who are you?
My name is Cameron Parsell. I work here at the Uni of Queensland, do social science research, mostly focusing on homelessness and social housing.
What is homelessness?
In Australia, we think about homelessness officially in a really kind of broad way. We think about the adequacy of housing and particularly whether people have access to a space that enables them to live in a certain way. And when we think about homelessness, we think about people not having a place where they can take control of their lives fundamentally, where they don't have a place where they can be themselves, where they can entertain others. That's really fundamentally how homelessness is thought about. Of course, when we have a broad kind of notion like that, two things are important. One, I think it really captures fundamentally this notion of home, because home is much more significant than a dwelling or a built environment. It's really about a state of being and an experience and a memory or an aspiration, even the type of life we want to have. But also when we have this kind of fuzzy or social notion of homelessness, that means lots and lots of people get included. In Australia, people who are homeless not just if they're on the streets sleeping rough, but also if they're in accommodation where they don't have safety, where they don't have autonomy, where they don't have a space of their own, homeless accommodation, boarding houses, of course, but also people in severely overcrowded housing. And we know that many people who are homeless in Australia are actually living in severely overcrowded housing. So they actually have a house as such, they live in a dwelling, a structure, but that structure, because it's severely overcrowded, doesn't enable them the dimensions of home, the things that we come to expect in contemporary Australian society as constituting home.
Brilliant. Okay, and how do people end up homeless?
How do people end up homeless? That's a really, really good question. I think there isn't a clear answer. It's debated by many, many people. There's long been, because it's a similar question to how do people end up being poor. And for, the last 300 or 400 years, scholars have debated that. What we do know is that all people who are homeless are poor. We also know that all people who are homeless are unable to engage within some major structural institutions of Australian society, particularly the housing system, but also the welfare system and other types of social service systems. Fundamentally, we know that people who are living on the streets, they're the minority of the people who ever become homeless in Australia, but most of the people who live on the streets and end up doing so for a long time, they speak about homelessness as a continuation of a long life of disengagement and alienation and marginalisation from mainstream institutions of Australian society. So many people on the streets talk about moving from prison or moving from insecure accommodation onto the streets. They talk about childhoods characterised by the child protection system, abuse, juvenile justice as adolescent, long-term unemployment. Of course, what we do also know is that many people who are homeless also are new migrants to Australia, doubling up in those severely overcrowded dwellings. Many people who are homeless because they're a young person either alone or a young person in a dependent family leaving violence. So many people who are homeless are responding to different situations, but nearly always have a structural dimension in terms of the adequacy of the housing system and the welfare system, or even the adequacy of the state to respond to violent households, to perpetrators of violence within the family home.
Well, fantastic. And does this affect a range of cultural groups, or is it something that exclusively affects Aboriginal people?
Aboriginal people are well overrepresented when it comes to homelessness in Australia. They constitute roughly 2% of the Australian population, but on the best figures we have, maybe 1 in 5 of all people who are homeless in Australia are Indigenous. So Indigenous people are profoundly overrepresented when we think about homelessness. But I think it's also important to take into account this notion of what constitutes home. And many Indigenous people argue that home is about connection to country, home is about connection to land, but it's also about connection to family, and also about connection with Aboriginal identity. So when we think about these kind of bureaucratic definitions of homelessness we use for statistical purposes, we have to really critically ask ourselves, do they apply? Are they meaningful for Indigenous people? This is particularly the case for Indigenous people that are leaving violence and going to stay with family or extended kin, because in fact many of them would say that they're actually not homeless. They do feel like they have a place, they're with family, and they're supported in a way that what's meaningful for them is intact. But of course that's not to understate that all forms of poverty, all forms of disadvantage in Australia are disproportionately affect Indigenous people, and that certainly is the case. But on a number basis, most people who are homeless in Australia are not Indigenous. Most people who are homeless in Australia would identify as Anglo-Australian, and that's because the structural inequalities within Australian society affect everyone. There are groups that are disproportionately affected, but nevertheless, new migrants experience homelessness, Indigenous people, Anglo-Australians, and everyone in between.
Fantastic. One of the things that we've found troubling in this context is that when we've looked at the housing stock in Brisbane, it looks really quite decent actually. So you hear these horror stories of places like Inala, and you're confronted on the ground with villas that people would pay £500,000 for in the Costa del Sol or something like that. Can you talk around is that a success, or is there something? Are we blinded to the problems that people who live in that accommodation face by virtue of the fact that it just looks beautiful and they've got gardens? Or I don't know. Can you talk around that?
What I think this idea of housing and homelessness, these questions really represent is this complex idea of what it is to be at home or what it is to be homeless, and I think we need to look beyond the stereotypical image of homelessness as a one-dimensional construct that affects essentially single males with a bottle living on the streets. Homelessness is much more nuanced and complex and just far more widely distributed across the society. And we know that many people who are homeless are living in really inadequate and particularly insecure and unsafe dwellings, and it's very, very hard for us to identify that from the facade of a house. So notwithstanding some really, really impressive housing stock in Australia and disadvantaged neighbourhoods in Australia, on the most part, particularly disadvantaged urban neighbourhoods in Australia, don't compare to the disadvantaged urban neighbourhoods in other parts of the world, some in Europe, in the UK, particularly in the US. But what is important to know is that a lot of homelessness in Australia is concealed. We know that many, many children and women who experience significant violence in the home, they actually don't have anything that they would see as a meaningful home for them. Their lives are characterised by this perpetual fear of violence and this threat of harm. So whilst we cannot from the outside, from the house, see that they're homeless, they actually are living in a way that they feel homeless. So it's kind of important to reconcile the difference on the one hand with what may appear like adequate accommodation, and on the other the experience of the residents and the inhabitants inside, and whether that what seems like adequate or functional housing does represent a home for people. This is particularly important in the context of violence, but also in the context of overcrowding, also in terms of affordability. We know that many people may be living in housing that is very, very functional from an objective standard, but people are paying up to anywhere from 70 to 80, 90% of their income in order to stay in that housing. So that financial insecurity, that precariousness, really adds another dimension to this idea of what it is to feel secure and comfortable in a home.
Brilliant. Okay. We've had this interesting engagement with Malcolm Dixon, this housing developer. His argument is that entrepreneurs like him are just robbed by the state. So he has amassed this huge fortune in his mind, God knows if it's true, through his own grit and determination, and all he faces is a government stealing from him. Can you explain the ways in which people like Malcolm Dixon, housing developers, have benefited from the state?
Well, we often like to think in Australia about the way the state provides assistance to people to access housing, and in Australia we very, very narrowly think about housing assistance as only that in the terms of social housing, when in actual fact the state plays a very, very active role in enabling not only middle class people to buy housing for their homes, but the state plays a really active role in ensuring that middle class Australians can acquire a second and a third and a portfolio of investment properties. And these are done through a range of taxation measures, including negative gearing, whereby second and third properties are able to be considered a tax write-off, the difference between the mortgage repayment and the rent received. So the state plays a very active role in enabling lots of people to access housing, both as a home and also as a form of investment. In terms of developers, of course, the state plays a very, very active role in enabling developers to develop certain types of stock to ensure that it's regulated in a way that they benefit greatly from state legislation. Of course, developers would never ever want the state to pull out of active intervention, because then it would be a free-for-all. Then they wouldn't have the type of market that they need. So we really need to think critically about this idea that it's only the other, the different, the distinct poor over there that are actually benefits of state housing, when in actual fact, in a society such as Australia, and in fact I think you would argue most advanced economies, the state plays a really active role in enabling us all to access housing, although some of it's implicit, whereas the social housing is much more explicit. I've never seen anything credible anywhere that suggested that Australian taxation revenues are falling. On the other hand, all of the data and the evidence would suggest that Australian taxation revenues increase. And there's a very interesting and complicated relationship between the level of taxation and government regulation and housing supply. But what we do know is that developers always want to be able to have less restrictions in terms of what they can build, where they can build it, and what they can do with it. And I think the short answer is I don't understand really the argument or the basis of that type of comment that falling revenue is a barrier for housing provision. What I think is important to say is that we often conflate the causes of homelessness with the solutions of homelessness. The causes of homelessness are nearly always complex. They're multifaceted, and they involve the interaction of severe structural conditions with the biographical and the individual aspects of people's lives. And these are very, very complicated things to understand. On the other hand, we know that solutions to homelessness are far less complex. They nearly always involve a house, enabling people to access house, and enabling a very small number of people who are homeless the means to access support so that they can sustain their housing. So we often get caught up in the complexities of the causes of homelessness as a justification for not adequately responding with solutions of homelessness. And the latter are much more straightforward and simple and can be achieved. And they can be achieved in a way where the causes of homelessness don't necessarily need to be addressed.
Right, so Dixon says he doesn't benefit in any way, shape or form from the state. The state is just an impediment to his business. Is that contradictory, and how has the state benefited these people?
I mean, it's one of the great consistencies of life, isn't it? We hear developers or other people in private enterprise who really lament the state for their interference or their inadequacy to help them, or more importantly, they really lament the state because they're a barrier to their business. And many, many people, and I think as exemplified most significantly, many people in the private development sector benefit in every respect from the state. If it wasn't for the state legislation, people wouldn't be able to easily access mortgages. If it wasn't for state intervention, people wouldn't get first home buyers grants, so money from the state to go and buy a newly developed home. In Queensland, for example, home buyers get more money if they're buying a new place compared to an existing dwelling, more money from the state. And then, of course, the state greatly supports the development industry by legislating in terms of what can be built, where it can be built. And then, of course, we have to look at the way the state enables these private developers to make money by building roads out there to their developments, by building power, water, by building schools out there. I mean, there are a range of legitimate policy mechanisms that the state absolutely and fundamentally backs up the developers to do what they need to do. And of course, this is not even taking into consideration all of the alleged corruption whereby private developers incentivise the state through political donations in order to get favourable decisions about their development. So this idea that the state is a barrier for private developers is complete rubbish, when in actual fact the state enables them to make profits by making people rich from housing, including themselves. So there's a real expectation that they should be providing back in terms of social housing or affordable housing, or a commitment to enable people to access housing that's cheap.